one of you here. Before I get started, I want to thank Chris Cobell and everyone who participated in making this teen retreat we had yesterday a huge success. I was here most of the day. I didn't get to finish out because I had some things I needed to do on the farm, but it was really good. The kids really enjoyed it. We had good attendance. There were a lot of tears of joy and happiness in getting to be together for the first time probably for some of them in a couple of years. And I was really pleased with the way this congregation supported that, the help that was here yesterday, all the good food that was here. I had one of Sherry's sweet rolls this morning for breakfast. And man, alive, what good cinnamon rolls. I could brag on all of you because everything I ate yesterday was excellent. Melissa had a really good breakfast casserole, and so we need to schedule a breakfast for September and allow the rest of you to sample what I got to try yesterday. We have so much talent. We are working on trying to put every bit of that talent to full employment, and we really are going to grow as a result of it. The attitude, the spirit, everything here is really positive, and we want to keep it going that direction. One of the things I was struck by yesterday is the ability of the speakers to get on the kids' level. And it's important that you do that. Teenagers become kind of aliens for a few years while they're in that period. Adults can't figure them out. And but all we have to do is remember when we were teenagers. But Chris and our Chris Jordan, Chris Casebolt, Zach, all of them were able to talk on their levels, and it meant a whole lot to them. And I was proud of what took place here yesterday. And Chris Cobell spent who knows how many hours in organizing it and putting it together. All of that's appreciated. We're going to finish Acts 27-28 today, or bust. We've been in it a while, but I'm overextended with my own hours with all I've committed myself to do. And so Wesley is going to teach the parables after we finish Acts. And we are going to go over the next two chapters in a fairly rapid fashion. I would encourage you to go back and study and think about some of the lessons that are in these two chapters that I may not touch on. But Acts chapter 27 is pretty much Paul's trip to Rome. And it was not a luxury liner that he went on. I was thinking about this as I studied this chapter and almost got seasick thinking about it. And I can't imagine what those people went through. But we're going to look at that today. Acts 27, 1 through 8, and when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the Centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete, over against Salmone. And hardly passing it, came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lycia. So the first question, how was Paul taken to Rome, and what time of year was it? He was taken by ship. He was a prisoner. He was under the overlook of Julius, who was a centurion. We've already mentioned the fact that the centurions are usually always practically mentioned favorably. Julius was no exception. And he was taken by ship along with a bunch of other prisoners. Aristarchus is mentioned here. Paul mentions him by name. Aristarchus was a friend of Paul's. He traveled with Paul in his journeys. And he's mentioned here he may have been a prisoner himself just because of his association with Paul. The Bible doesn't tell us that, so that is a speculation. But Aristarchus is along for the ride. Aristarchus, by tradition, was martyred during Nero's reign. And so that was a good few years after this. And likely Aristarchus was released once he got to Rome and was heard. Luke was along for the ride as well. And his recording of the terrifying events that are going to take place on this journey are very accurate. There was a Scottish sailor named Commodore James Smith who analyzed the comments that James makes in Acts for accuracy. And for the most part, Luke's very accurate with regard to what he has to say about the things that took place, where they wound up, the efforts they made to get to where they wanted to go, all were in keeping with good practice and dealing with the situations that these sailors and so on found themselves having to deal with. There are always skeptics that try to find holes in the Scripture. And the Scripture's been with us for 2,000 years almost, and there have been thousands and thousands, maybe millions of efforts to try to discredit it, and it can't be done because it is here with us by the Holy Spirit. And there's always some new thing that comes up, but you can't refute history. And Luke was an accurate historian. And it's been documented by people who know these things to be true. Number two, who was Julius and how did he treat Paul? Okay, he was a centurion in the Roman army. And he treated Paul with kindness. The trip that they took headed up to Sidon. They went to Sidon. And Sidon was a city in Phoenicia. The practice during this time of year, and we didn't answer that part of the first question, but it was getting toward fall as all of this took place. And so it was really not the best time to try to go to Rome because this time of year of the winds, and that's, I'll get off, that's question 3. But this period of time shows them sailing kind of northeast up the coast of Phoenicia to Sidon. And when they get there, Paul is allowed to go spend some time with friends and be refreshed. It is speculated that maybe Paul was a little sick at this point in time, and so he is allowed to go to his friends and be treated or whatever to feel better. And the Bible does not tell us that either. There's all kinds of speculation about what could have taken place. It could be just one comfort. And so we have to leave that for Paul to tell us when we get to heaven. What made this journey a slow and dangerous process? The winds. This time of year, the winds blew the opposite direction. And so ships would tack along the coast trying to stay close to land. In the event of a storm or something like that, they could get in and get out of it. It's always been a curiosity to me how a ship could sail into the wind, but they do that by tacking. And it takes a whole lot longer to get where you're going because of that practice. They sail about 60 miles northeast to Sidon. Number 4, what advice did Paul give the centurion and crew? Paul, if you think about the situation as it exists here, this is probably a government ship, and probably Julius is in charge of the whole 9 yards. The shipmaster and the sailors and all of them are subservient to Julius, because Julius, if you read this chapter, is the one who makes the calls on what goes on. He decides to go, he decides not to go. But something that comes out in this as well is Paul is included in this effort to decide what to do. How many times did Paul say had been shipwrecked? 3 times. Paul has some experience with this. And so they include Paul as they discuss what they're going to do. Paul, not from inspiration, because we know this turns out different, but by his own knowledge advises this is not going to end well for us. There could be loss of life and property. And he advised them not to go. But the captain and Julius decide to take a chance and do it. Acts 27, 9 through 26. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, that's how you know what time of year this was, it was in the fall, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenicia and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they obtained their purpose, losing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after they arose against a tempestuous wind called Rochelidon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up under the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps, undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after a long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you, be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as he was told me. Excuse me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. Paul told Julius and those who were in charge this was going to be a dangerous journey. And he told them that would likely end in the loss of life and property. It definitely ended in loss of property. They were sailing during an extremely dangerous time. There are winds that blow out of the mountains of Crete that can blow softly, or they can be very tempestuous. The mountains in Crete, some of them get up to 7,000 feet. And it creates a situation during this time of year that can be fierce. Literally, this ship sailed in a typhoon. If you've ever watched into the old World War II footage of the ships that sailed into the Pacific and what they went through, and I remember talking to Ed Fish about this, he experienced it himself, but these waves are monstrous. And if you've been on any of the World War II ships, they were huge. And so your imagination really has to kind of stretch to envision what they were going through. But there's film footage of those ships in World War II literally being drowned by waves and rolled over on their sides and doing all kinds of things trying to sail through what they went through. If you've ever been nauseated from car sickness or seasickness, try to picture how these people felt as they were trying to do what they did. I got seasick on Watauga Lake one time. And so Kim's worse than I am. If you ever see us go anywhere, it's not me driving. I can drive straight down the street and she'll get sick. So she drives all the time. And so a cruise is not in our future. She won't do it, and I really don't want to myself. But all kinds of things can happen when you're on the ocean. And the things that happen in the Mediterranean Sea at the time of year, James Smith documented that all the things that Luke talks about as they try to sail, going under islands and trying to stay out of these strong winds is accurate. But as we get to number 5, why did they not winter at Fair Haven, and what encouraged them to make a run? Fair Havens was a port, and if you get your Bible maps out and look at them, Crete is a long island that's oriented kind of lengthwise east-west. Fair Havens is on the bottom side of that island, and it is open to the Mediterranean. And according to what I read, this Fair Havens port was a big, wide, open harbor. It was not safe in a storm. If you go on around the tip of Crete and look where they wanted to go, Phoenicia is only 40 miles away, and Luke points out its direction with regard to the island in his comments. But Phoenicia is on around up on the edge, and they had safe harbor. And so the day that Julius and the captain decided they were going to make a run for it, the winds were blowing real soft and gentle and warm. Let's do it. It's only 40 miles away. We know ourselves that the weather can change just like that. And that's exactly what happened on this journey. They set out under fair winds and almost immediately are hit by this storm. King James calls this storm Euroclydon. The term is actually, my mind just went blank, give me just a second, Euroclydon, which is a Roman word that speaks to the direction that the wind was blowing. And the other, it's not a big deal, but the translators of the King James called the storm the incorrect word. But the Roman sailors used Euroclydon to suggest that the winds were blowing in a north-northwest wind, and that's generated out of the mountains, as I mentioned earlier. Number 7, how did Paul comfort the sailors? Right. From the time Paul spoke on the steps in Jerusalem and then went all through those trials and all those things, Jesus came and stood with him. Here an angel comes and stands with him and tells him to be comforted. Everything's going to be okay. And I'm making really short shrift of this awful trip. But when I was reading this, like I said, I almost got seasick myself. Because if you think about the violent storm that they were in for 2 weeks, Luke says they hadn't eaten anything in 2 weeks. And that's kind of a general statement that doesn't mean they didn't eat anything. But if you think about how sick they probably were, they didn't really want to eat much. They had food on board, and so it was not like they couldn't eat. They weren't able, didn't feel like it. And so as they have been on this now for 2 weeks and they've been beaten half to death, they've thrown things overboard, they've thrown everything they could throw overboard, trying to lighten the ship and to bear up under this storm. Paul says, you should have listened to me, but everything's going to be all right. An angel has come and told me we're all going to live. He says, so take heart, eat something, and get ready to finish this out. And then he sat down, gave thanks, and ate. They all took courage and ate something as well. Jack, if you got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this morning. Paul has already been told that he has to testify of Jesus in Rome. So I got to think with Paul's faith, he never thinks his own life is in danger. His concern has always been for the rest of the crew. And this news only really reinforces that everybody else is doing the same too. So I just hadn't thought about that until I looked at the story.
And I think that's true. If you look at how we deal with things with faith. I think it could be said we have dealt with the plague with faith. But how many of us get a little bit of unsurety when we hear about somebody getting sick and get just a little bit of nervousness down there, and then you got to say, we're going to get through this. Bobby and Mary are getting better, according to Facebook. We've got people here that have already had it and survived, and we have moved forward with the faith that we're doing the right thing. We know we're doing the right thing by doing what God says to do. And so that's what we're going to continue to do. But when you listen to the news, and I don't recommend it. Who was it said that yesterday? May have been our Chris. But when you listen to the news, a little bit of doubt can creep in. And of all the awful things that's happened this past week that just make your stomach turn, there's obviously a little bit of doubt. And so our faith and belief have to override that. I believe as you see Paul arrive in Rome and talk about the fact that he took courage, he was fighting with the human side of himself in doing this. And when Paul advised not to go, he advised from his own knowledge of what was going to take place. And he knew by faith that he was going to go to Rome. But don't you know there were a period of times when the ship was about upside down, he began to wonder. And that's human. Not to mention the fact he was probably seasick as well. And these are all assumptions. All it is.
You know, Mike, when you look at God is faithful. God says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and I'll take care of you. That's exactly what he'll do. He told Paul, you're going to Rome. And it didn't matter what happened, but God's in control. And if God says you're going to Rome, you're going to Rome.
Right.
And he'll keep his word. We just need to have, like you said, the faith. They're going, when we stayed in Corinth, they had that little isthmus. Well, they didn't go up to the, and go through the isthmus, so they went through the most dangerous part of the sea they could go through anyway. And most of the people went that way, shipwrecked. And there have been a lot of people killed in there. So, I mean, this trip had danger written all over it. But Paul wasn't relying on the winds. He wasn't relying on the suppositions. He was relying on the word of God.
Right, right. Good points. This ship, yeah.
Well, in verse 25 it says, therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, that it will be just as he told me. It didn't excuse Paul from suffering what everybody else was suffering. You know, he was on the same boat, he was in the same storm, he was feeling the same effects of it. He was suffering everything they were suffering, but he had a purpose for his. And he had an end in sight for his suffering. And he said, so I can sit here and I can go through all this up and down and round because I know God has said I'm going to be okay. It didn't take away the symptoms, but it made enduring them a lot easier.
Right. Something comes to mind as you made your comment about Paul. Paul's first several years as an adult was spent persecuting the church. As you sow, so shall you reap. There are going to be consequences to your actions. And even though Paul was pulled out of that by Christ's appearance to him on the road to Damascus and showing him the right direction to go, Paul was a sincere man. In a sense, he is harvesting what he reaped earlier by all the things he had to endure. Paul recounts the awful things that he had endured for Christ's sake in 2 Corinthians. And once again, I'm surmising, but our actions will have reactions. And some of the things that Paul happened, he didn't ever say that he wished he didn't have to go through all these things. He accepted them as part of his life and the reactions that he was getting possibly because of his actions. But Paul, with his faith, pushed forward doing the right thing. And as a result of that, God's with him. He knows he is. But the human side of him still got to deal with that because he was not superhuman. And the Holy Spirit didn't have his brain wrapped up in the net so that it couldn't go bad places. And when we see Paul make it to Italy, we talk about it, the Bible in chapter 28 talks about him taking courage, which means that at one point he was discouraged. And keeping all these things in mind as we think about this, and as you go back and read this for yourself and put yourself in their shoes as they dealt with this awful storm, this was no small ship. There is a sarcophagus, I think in Alexandria, that has a carving on the side of it that, or where Alexandria was, that has a sarcophagus on the side of it that shows what this ship looked like. There were 276 passengers, I think it said, on this ship. And so this was no small boat. You see these big cruise liners that people go on cruisers on. I've often wondered how those things stay upright. They're so top-heavy at piers. There must be a huge counter under the water. But for the time, this was a big boat. But it was beaten to death ultimately in this trip. Paul advised them to take something to eat. They had worked hard to save the storm. They hadn't eaten much, and they obviously were in a weakened condition. But they took heart when they saw Paul take bread, give thanks, and they took his advice to eat something. Acts 27 through 44. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. That's 120 feet, by the way. A fathom is 6 feet. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under color, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, "This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you." And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it off, he began to eat. Then they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were all on the ship 216 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas meet, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast, and remained unmovable. But the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And the rest, some on board, some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they all escaped, all safe to land. Number 8, where did the ship wreck? Who helped them there? The name of this island at the time was Mileto. Malta is the name of the island today. It is a big rock, in essence, of an island. According to the commentary, there's an average of a foot of soil on that rock. And so it is not the place to be involved in farming. But today is about 500,000 people live on this rock. And it is a place that they had blown to. They had gone 474 miles in these 14 days, driven by this storm. And Luke points out that they lifted it up and let her run. There are all kinds of comments that can be made about this that point to the accuracy of Luke, but I won't get done if I do. But this bread that Paul took was more than likely a little hard piece of wheat bread. And when it says they took meat, they were taking bread. After they had eaten, they threw it overboard. They saw the beach. They decided to make a run for it. And if you've been to the beach, anytime there's a water outlet or where waters run together from flow, it makes a sandbar. And so when they struck the foresail, or is that the right term? I'm not Luke. But anyway, they put it out there so the wind could get in it with the hope they could drive the ship into the beach. But it hit the sandbar some distance from the beach. And so Paul said, if you let these sailors go, we're not going to make it. And they wouldn't have. They had dropped anchors to stabilize it, and they were going to bail. They were going to get out and leave the ship and the prisoners and everybody else to their own luck. But the soldiers cut the boat, and now they had to stay. They were committed. And so, long story short, the boat hits the sandbar. Julius prevents the prisoners from being killed because he didn't want Paul to be harmed. And those that swim to shore, and everybody else floats to shore on a piece of the ship. And so they get into the island, and they come up to what is referenced as barbarians. That's not the big, hairy, fur-covered stick with a thorn in it kind of thing you think of with a barbarian. These people that didn't speak Greek. And they lived on this island, and they took those people in and took care of them. They had been shipwrecked. They built a big fire. This was a time of year when it's cold and the water was blowing. They built a big fire and took care of them and fed them. There was a man there named Publius who was the chief, and he saw to it they had what they needed. In the process of, let's answer number 9. What notable miracles did Paul perform there? There's many people in this audience that are scared of snakes. And you think of Paul picking up an armload of wood, throwing it in the fire, and a viper reaches out and grabs his arm. And all the people there say, oh, he's going to die. And Paul shakes it off in the fire. He never swells, nothing ever happens. And they go from thinking he is a robber to thinking he's a god. What's the other big miracle he performs? Publius' father had dysentery. And according to what I read, one of the dysenteries they have is from drinking goat milk that's infected with Bacillus dysenterius. You impressed? Dirty hens are more than likely the problem there, the people who milk the goat milk. And a risk in drinking raw milk is that. If you're going to buy raw milk, be sure and buy it from somebody who is clean. I saw a lot growing up that I won't discuss with you there, but more than likely that was Publius' father's issue. Paul healed him. And so the things that Paul did resulted in them having good treatment for the next 3 months. And so when they leave for Rome, the people at Malta be sure they have everything they need to make the trip. When did Paul finally arrive in Rome, and how was he received? I answered time already. What'd you say? Yeah. It took 3 months. They stayed in Malta for the remaining period of time, and when he got to Rome, he was met by Christians, and the Bible points out that he was encouraged. And it always is encouraging to be with the brethren. If you could have been here yesterday and seen the tears in people's eyes because of what was taking place, that in part was a joy in being together again. And we all feel that when we're here. And that is not to be made lightly of ever. Hebrews 10:25, God recognizes the importance of the encouragement we have in being together. And man's wisdom doesn't override that. Number 11, what did Paul do after he got settled in his own place with a guard in Rome? Called the chief of the Jews together, and what did he do? He preached the same message he had preached all over the world at this point. He told them about the procession, the logical procession of the Jewish law into the Christian age and how they need to respond. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. When they heard it was for the Gentiles, they get up and leave and get in an argument among themselves. What's interesting about this, for all the hatred that Paul dealt with in Jerusalem, they didn't know about that in Rome. And so Paul, as we move toward the end of Acts here, and Luke finishes this up, spends the next 2 years in a rented home and was allowed to have visitors, and he preached and taught the truth to everybody that came to him. And based on, at least in part, tradition, Paul was released this imprisonment and went back to Asia, visited some churches, went to Spain and preached. That's where he was arrested the second time. But it's believed that Paul even made it to the British Isles at some point. And we don't know that. Once again, this is surmising. All we know for sure is what Scriptures tell us. But Paul was a preacher we can all respect and model ourselves after Christ. Thank you. I've enjoyed teaching Acts, and Wesley will take over next week.